I spent 40 years taking care of others. Patients, coworkers, neighbors, and my son most of all. I thought that's what love was. Giving until there's nothing left to give. When he came to me, desperate to save his business, I didn't hesitate. I cashed out my pension, sold my house, and told him, "We'll build something together." For the first time since my husband passed, I felt needed again, useful, but love makes you blind in ways age doesn't fix. Months later, he was gone, the business, the money, the son I thought I knew. What followed wasn't rage. It was silence. Cold, heavy silence that forces you to face who you really are when everyone you built your life around walks away. And in that silence, I decided to rebuild. Not for him, but for me. I never really stopped taking care of people. Even after I retired from the hospital, it just became something I did without thinking. It's like breathing. You don't plan it, you just do it. For 40 years, nursing was who I was. I could tell someone's pain before they said a word. Maybe that's why the silence of retirement felt so loud. My house in Savannah was quiet in a way I hadn't expected. The first few months, I filled the time with things that made me feel useful. Volunteering twice a week at the free clinic downtown, baking for the neighbors, keeping my little rose garden alive in the Georgia heat. I had names for each plant: Gracie, Hope, William, after my husband. He passed 3 years before that, a stroke that came without warning, and the garden became my way of keeping him close. Most mornings, I'd make coffee and sit by the kitchen window where the light hit the roses just right. I'd talk to him sometimes, not out loud, but in my head, telling him how the day was going, what I'd cooked, or how the clinic was short on volunteers again. I told myself I was fine. I even believed it most days. But evenings were harder. That's when the house would start to feel too big. The ticking clock, the hum of the refrigerator, they were the only sounds that kept me company. My son Daniel lived just 2 hours away, but you'd think it was 2 states from how little I heard from him. I didn't blame him, not really. He had his own life, a business, bills, maybe new friends I hadn't met. Still, every time the phone rang, my heart jumped a little, hoping it was him. That night, it finally was. I remember it so clearly. The sun had gone down, and the cicadas were singing outside, that soft summer chorus that never stops in Savannah. I was washing dishes when the phone buzzed on the counter. When I saw his name, Daniel Carter, my breath caught. "Hey, baby," I said, trying not to sound too eager. He didn't say hello. Just this long sigh that told me something was wrong. "Mom, I wouldn't be calling if it wasn't bad," he said, his voice tight. I dried my hands on the towel, suddenly alert. "What happened?" He hesitated, then said, "The business, it's not doing well. I've had to let people go, and the bank's talking foreclosure." I leaned against the counter, my heart sinking. Daniel had started his construction company 5 years ago, all confidence and excitement. He told me back then, "Mom, I'm finally going to build something that lasts." He'd always been good with his hands, even as a boy, fixing things around the house that his father never got to. I was proud of him for chasing that dream. What can I do? The words came out before I even thought them through. He paused, and I could almost hear the shame in his silence. "I hate asking you for help," he said, "but I just need a little breathing room, a few months to turn things around." I sat down at the table, tracing the edge of the wood with my finger. "You know I'll help if I can," I said quietly. He let out a breath, like he'd been holding it the whole time. "I knew you'd say that. You're the only one who believes in me." Something in me softened right then. That same motherly instinct that had guided every decision I'd ever made. It wasn't pride, it wasn't obligation. It was love, plain and simple. I told myself that's what family was for. Stepping in when no one else would. After we hung up, I sat there for a while, staring at the phone, listening to the faint hum of the air conditioner. Outside, lightning bugs flickered over the grass. It reminded me of when Daniel was little, how he'd run barefoot through the yard with a jar, laughing, trying to catch every bit of light he could. Back then, I thought if I loved him enough, he'd always find his way. But love, I've learned, doesn't always protect people from themselves. The next morning, I woke up early and made a list. It's something nurses do. Lists calm the chaos. I wrote out everything. My savings, my pension account, even the emergency fund I'd tucked away after William passed. I wasn't sure how much Daniel would need, but I wanted to be ready. It wasn't about money. It was about giving him a chance to breathe again, to feel like life hadn't beaten him down. At the clinic that afternoon, while I was organizing supplies, I caught myself smiling, thinking maybe this was the start of something good. Maybe helping Daniel would help me too. One of the younger nurses, Carla, noticed. "You're glowing today, Miss Evelyn," she said. "You win the lottery or something?" I laughed. "No, honey. Just a good phone call. My son's finally talking to me again." She smiled. That kind of polite smile young people give when they don't fully understand. "That's nice," she said, going back to her work. But for me, it was more than nice. It was everything. That night, I found an old photo album from when Daniel was in high school. Pictures of him at his first job, smiling wide, holding a hammer. His father used to say, "That boy's got hands built for building." I believed it too. So when Daniel called again a few days later, sounding lighter, hopeful, I was ready to listen. "Mom," he said, "I've got a plan. I found a small property, perfect spot for new homes. If I can just get one investor to back it, I can rebuild, literally." The way he said it, full of life again, made my chest ache with pride. "Tell me what you need," I said. He hesitated. "It's just temporary. You wouldn't lose a thing. Once the houses sell, I'll pay you back every penny with interest." "You deserve that." I didn't care about the money. Hearing his voice like that, confident, passionate, was payment enough. "I trust you, baby," I said softly. "We'll figure it out together." After we hung up, I went outside to water the roses. The sun was dipping low, and the air smelled like honeysuckle and soil. I remember whispering to William like I always did. "You'd be proud of him," I said. "He's trying." That night I couldn't sleep. Not from worry, from excitement. For the first time in years, I felt useful again. I wasn't just a retired nurse waiting for her days to pass. I was a mother with purpose, helping her son rebuild his life. The next week, Daniel came to visit. It had been nearly a year since he'd last stopped by. When he pulled up in that old truck of his, I felt tears sting my eyes. He hugged me tight, kissed my cheek, and said, "You still smell like lavender, Mom." We sat on the porch drinking sweet tea, watching the lake shimmer in the distance. He talked about the business, the stress, the partners who'd bailed, and how he just needed a fresh start. I listened, nodding, asking little questions like I always did when I was a nurse, gently, to let people find their own answers. "You've always been my rock," he said, his eyes soft. "I don't know what I'd do without you." I smiled. "You won't have to find out." That night, as I washed the dishes, I thought about all the patients I'd seen over the years, the ones who came in broken and scared, and how my job was never really about curing them, but about helping them feel seen. Maybe that's all Daniel needed too, to feel seen, understood, believed in. When he left the next morning, he hugged me again. "Thank you, Mom," he said, looking straight into my eyes. "You won't regret this." I watched him drive away down that dirt road until his truck disappeared behind the trees. The house felt quiet again, but different this time, full of purpose instead of emptiness. Later that day, I sat at the kitchen table, pen in hand, signing a few forms he'd left behind. Just small things, he'd said, routine, necessary for the business paperwork. I didn't read them too closely. I trusted him. When I was done, I poured myself another cup of coffee and looked out at the roses swaying in the afternoon light. "He just needs one more chance," I whispered to myself, like a promise. And with that, I believed I was doing the right thing. I couldn't have known that the hand I was offering to lift him up would be the same hand he'd used to let me fall. When I first handed over the check, it felt like giving a flashlight to someone stumbling in the dark. Daniel took it with both hands. His face lit up in a way I hadn't seen for a long time. The same way it had been when he was a boy and fixed the screen door or mended his father's toolbox. He folded the slip of paper and tucked it into his wallet like a promise. We didn't announce anything grand. We didn't need to. This was something between us, a quiet pact. He would get the business back on its feet, and I would be the safety net beneath him. For the first weeks, it felt right in a way that settled into my bones. We ate dinners together again, sometimes simple things he always loved. His favorite stewed tomatoes and rice, or the fried chicken that took me half the afternoon to get just right. He'd laugh at my stories about the clinic and the volunteers, and I'd listen to him talk about bids and blueprints. Those evenings wrapped around me like an old shawl, part comfort, part protection. Because I'd been a nurse so long, organizing chaos had become second nature. Paperwork calmed me, lists, ledgers, schedules. So when Daniel said, "Mom, can you just look over the books? Keep things tidy? I can't do it and run a job site." I didn't hesitate. I sat at his little folding table in the spare room and went through invoices, receipts, and bank statements with a careful eye. I labeled envelopes, made a binder for payroll, and even set up a spreadsheet with neat columns and little headings in my careful handwriting. It helped him sleep better, he said. It helped me feel useful again. There were small, ordinary victories. A supplier got paid on time because I'd noticed a missed email. A foreman's payroll was straightened out after I found a misapplied check. Daniel started to show up earlier to dinner sometimes, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He hugged me in the doorway more than once and whispered, "You keep me straight, Mom." Those words were medicine, but money has a way of revealing truth in small, stubborn ways. The first time I noticed something was wrong, it was a phone call from the hardware store. "Mrs. Carter? This is Ray at Ray's Supply. I'm calling about the payment for the plywood delivered last month." It bounced back. I remember the way my hand lifted from the phone like it was hot. Ray had been polite, utterly practical about it, and I felt, embarrassingly, like a failure before I'd even begun. I went home that night and opened the ledger. I ran my finger down the page where Daniel had written dates and amounts in his hurried script. A check had been written for the plywood, but the stamp on the bank slip showed returned. When I asked him about it that evening, he pinched the bridge of his nose and said, "It was a bank error. They'll fix it by morning." I wanted to trust him. I wanted to believe in the story that made his voice softer, that returned the boyish optimism under the man's stress. But there were other little things. An invoice here without a matching receipt there. A withdrawal from our joint account that was vaguely labeled MISC. When I mentioned one of these to him, he either laughed it off or grew quiet, giving me an explanation that sounded like someone improvising a tune he hadn't practiced. "It's cash flow, Mom. You know how construction goes. One job pays late, another pays early. It's the rhythm." His hands moved when he talked, making the air count the beats for him. I'd been on wards where rhythm mattered, and I knew the difference between a rhythm and a heartbeat racing out of control. There were nights I stayed up, not just counting numbers, but feeling the shape of things. I would find myself replaying conversations, looking for the moment a promise had shifted into a mistake. In the kettle's whine and the hum of the refrigerator, I could hear the unasked question, had I made a mistake by trusting too easily? By stepping in with money and orders and spreadsheets? Love sometimes doesn't come with instruction manuals, and I'd never had one for motherhood or for the later chapters of life. For a while, Daniel's answers smoothed the wrinkles in my worry. He'd get a payment cleared, or a client would sign, and everything would lean back into balance. We'd sit on the porch together in the evening, and I'd watch him talk with that familiar energy, plans unfolding under his hands, and I'd feel the old faith returning. Maybe this was how it always worked. A push forward, a step back, and then forward again. Then there were the times he was sharp when I asked too many questions. "I'm handling it, Mom." he would say, with a voice that had the hard edge of someone pushed to the limit. You're worrying about things you don't need to worry about. He meant it, but the words landed like a small stone in a pond, making ripples I didn't like. I remember the moment so clearly. I'd asked about a check made out to a subcontractor with a different name than the one listed in the binder. He'd looked at the paper, then at me, and the eyes I'd known since he was born grew flat for a breath. That was an old subcontractor, he said. We used him last season. It's fine. Later, when I looked in the accounts again, the name matched no payroll I could find. Those were the whispers that became noise. A supplier asking why a payment hadn't been cleared. An electrician who mentioned the same invoice had been paid twice, once in cash, once by check. Each was a small, separate thing, but the thread they formed led somewhere I didn't want to walk alone. My pride bristled at the idea that I might be naive. My mother's heart hurt at the possibility that my son could be evasive. I found myself balancing two very old versions of myself. The nurse who saw illness, and the mother who refused to believe her child could harm her. When I confronted him, I tried to fold my anger into concern. Daniel, I'm seeing some inconsistencies, I said once, carefully, like I was administering a delicate medication. I need to understand these payments. He looked at me then with that same soft, too certain smile, and leaned forward across the table, elbows planted, as if anchoring himself to the moment. Eve, please, he said. He used the old nickname my husband had given me, and something inside me melted. You're making me feel like a criminal. I'm trying to keep us afloat. He was good at turning guilt into an apology for me, a skill I'd noticed in him since he was a teenager, turning social awkwardness into charm. I remember thinking, there are people who would take advantage of a mother's love. Daniel is not a bad man. He's someone under pressure. But the doubt had seated itself now, quiet and stubborn. It sat like dust in the corners, not always visible, but always there. Still, there were days that reminded me why I had done it. A neighbor's kid came over, and Daniel gave him a small tour of the worksite, showing him how to measure and mark. He explained everything like a teacher. I saw the way the boy's face lit up, and a part of me that had believed in him all along stood tall, proud. We fixed a leaky roof together one afternoon in a storm. We laughed as if nothing heavy existed. For a few hours we were just mother and son, the old comfortable duet we had always been. But responsibility has a long, patient way of asking questions until you answer them. One afternoon, an envelope arrived in the mail. A notice from a supplier, small and tight with formal language. I held it to the light and read that a balance remained unpaid for materials delivered 2 months prior. I carried the envelope in my hand and walked into the room where Daniel was counting something on his laptop. He glanced up, saw the notice, and his face closed like a book. We'll take care of it, he said, but the certainty I'd once leaned on turned brittle. I'm sorting it out, he added faster, like a man drafting a speech. He sounded weary, and I could hear the business of worry in the way his fingers tapped the keys. Then he stood, hugged me quickly, and left for what he called a meeting. After he walked out the door, I sat at the table with the notice in my lap and felt something shifting that had nothing to do with invoices. I had given my life savings away with prayer and method, with belief that love and leadership were the same thing. Maybe they had been for a time. But faith in the end needs truth to hold it up. I'd always believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt, and I still did. But if I was to keep giving, I owed myself the honesty of a clear-eyed watch. So I began to watch. Not in the way of a scolding parent, but like a nurse keeping a chart, careful, noting every small change. I checked bank statements first thing in the morning like taking a pulse. I called suppliers and asked, not accusingly, but plainly, has payment posted? Many times the answers were, not yet. Once, we tried to reach Daniel. I started to compile questions in my notebook, details filed under headings. When things were explained, they were logged. When they weren't, they lingered like a shadow. There was fear under the worry. a fear of being both right and wrong at the same time. If I was wrong, it would be humiliation I'd have to swallow. If I was right, it would be a betrayal that felt like something sharp pressed against my chest. Either way, the house of our brief reunion was changing, the warmth cooling into a more guarded, watchful air. And yet, despite the unease, I cooked his favorite meals when he came by. I made the bed in the spare room before he called it home for one more night. Love has a stubborn persistence. It cleans wounds and insults both. I told myself these were growing pains, that every business had hiccups and every family had its friction. I wanted to be the safe harbor for my son, the way I'd been the calm in the hospital ward for decades. So I kept tending the ledger, the garden, the dinners, and the edges of a relationship that had been both a blessing and a risk. The cracks were small now, hairline, hardly worth worrying about. I told myself that. I traced the ledger lines again, sipped my tea, and watched the late sun catch the leaves of the roses named for William. He just needs one more chance, I repeated to myself, like a lullaby, like a promise. The morning the world tilted, it began like any other. I woke to the soft gray light that slips in through the curtains in early November, the air smelling faintly of rain on the pavement outside. I padded into the kitchen, put the kettle on, and reached automatically for my mug, the one with the tiny chip on the rim that Rachel bought me years ago. Little rituals, I thought then, keep the shape of the day when nothing else will. When the phone didn't ring with the familiar clatter of Daniel's voice checking in, I didn't think much of it. He'd been gone a lot lately. Meetings, site visits, the kind of errands that leave a man with sawdust in his shoes and a constant forward look. Still, by noon, my worry had the shape of a question that would not leave me. I tried his number. Disconnected. I tried again. Dead silence. The recorded voice telling me the line was not in service. It's funny how small sounds suddenly matter. The hum of the refrigerator seemed too loud. The clock ticked too steady. I drove to his office as if I were going to find him there, hunched over a desk, a blueprint spread across his forearms. Instead, I found an empty room with a layer of dust on the windowsill and a folder on the receptionist's counter labeled with his company name. There were no foremen hovering in the doorway, no men with boots scratching the concrete. A padlock hung from the file cabinet, cold and unyielding. "Is he in?" I asked the woman who sat where the receptionist used to be. A substitute. Her face had the kind of sympathy you see at clinics when we told a patient the news they didn't want to hear. She shook her head. "No, ma'am. The landlord changed the locks 2 days ago. Said there was no notice." I remember the way my stomach folded at that. I walked to his apartment after that, the small place he rented on the edge of town. It was quiet. Curtains drawn, the mailbox empty. A neighbor I'd known from the clinic saw me standing at the door and said, "He left in the night. Truck's gone. Guess business was bad." Her voice was low, practical, trying not to say the words that would make me crumble. I didn't crumble. Not at first. There is a nurse's instinct that keeps you moving when things are breaking. You move because moving is useful. You get information and you use it. So I drove to the bank, hard in my throat, and walked into the familiar lobby where the tellers knew my name. I sat across from Mrs. Wallace, who'd handled our accounts for years. She had looked at me fondly when I brought in Daniel as a child for cookies at the bank's holiday event. Now she slid a file across the desk as if she were giving me something fragile and heavy. "Mrs. Carter, I'm so sorry," she said. And the words were a kind of rust on the hinges of the morning. "Have a seat." I sat and listened while she explained things I did not want to hear. There were withdrawals, large ones, that I had not authorized. Loans taken out in my name, with my signature forged, or so the bank's fraud department suspected. Checks drawn to companies that did not match any of Daniel's contracts. Payments to accounts in places I had never heard of. My hands went ice cold. The bank officer's words blurred into the hum of the air conditioner like a distant tide. "We've been trying to reach you," she said gently. "There were irregularities flagged last week, but because you were listed as the primary account holder on several lines, the bank proceeded with the authorizations. We've frozen what we can, but I'm afraid..." she faltered. Afraid of what? I knew then in the deep, precise part of me that nurses learn to use, the part that reads the patient's face and knows when the pulse has changed, that I had been taken. Not by some stranger in a shadowy alley, not by some slick scam artist I could warn others about, by my son. The hands that had once clapped at my garden fence, the hands that had learned to hold a hammer and to build, had been used to take the things I had spent a lifetime accumulating for safety. Shame arrived before the tears did. It is a peculiar companion. It makes your face hot and your voice small. I left the bank with a stack of notices and a number for a fraud investigator, and drove home through streets that looked unfamiliar, as if the whole town was waiting in the same way I was, to find out which side of the story would be true. In the small kitchen, under the pale afternoon light, I spread the notices out on the table like evidence in a case, and the names and figures felt like accordion bellows pulling the air from the room. Loans, cash advances. Line items labeled for equipment that never arrived at job sites I could no longer locate. The company, the one Daniel had built where we'd dreamed of houses rising and foundations held steady, had dissolved overnight. Papers filed by someone with a pen that was not mine. My signature had been imitated, smudged and pressed into paper where my consent should have sat like a stamp of trust. I put my hand to my mouth and tasted metal. People will tell you that money is only money. They will say you can recover it, that insurance will cover some things, that legal routes exist. Those things are true in a way, practical and useful, but they do not touch the specific kind of hollow that opens when the one you loved betrays you. The ledger is a ledger, but the missing presence is another kind of ledger altogether. There is a count for every laugh, every held hand, every time you stayed awake with a fevered child. Those things are not refundable. I sat down on the kitchen chair, and the wood sank under me, steady and indifferent. Bills lay there like small, square accusations. The phone sat mute on the counter. I dialed his number again and waited until the recorded voice told me the same thing, that the number no longer existed. He wouldn't leave me like that, I whispered at first, as if saying it might coax him back. My voice sounded thin in the house. When the tears did come, they were not the sharp, quick kind I'd given to grieving William. These slid down my cheeks slow and wet, heavy with something between sorrow and disbelief. I thought of the dinners we had shared, the nights he'd sat on the porch with me telling plans that sounded like prayers. I remembered smoothing the bad dream from his brow as a boy and protecting him from the small cruelties of other children. How do you reconcile those memories with a bank statement that lists you as debtor for a line of credit you never applied for? Neighbors came by without a fuss. Mrs. Green from next door with a casserole, Rachel with a hug that felt like a bandage. They sat around the kitchen table and listened as I told them the things I had learned. They shook their heads and used words like unbelievable and how could he? And those questions floored me. Here I was, a woman who'd spent decades asking the hard clinical questions in hospital rooms, suddenly bewildered and unable to compute the motive. Were there debts I hadn't known about? Was desperation so sharp it could reshape a son into someone who would bleed the mother he had? At night I lay awake and crossed my arms over my chest like a thin shield. The house hummed its domestic song. I thought about the ledger I had kept for Daniel's accounts, the neat columns, the small, careful math, and how helplessly inadequate those tidy rows now felt. I tried to shake the image of him walking away, but my memory would not hold to one scandal or another. Instead, it folded the small betrayals inside the larger one. The times he'd been brusque when I asked about payments. The nights he'd left the porch with his jaw tight and the polite lies he had told to avoid explanation. I had been a nurse and a mother. I had been trained in triage and in patience. Perhaps that was my undoing in this moment. My instinct to nurture when what was needed was suspicion. There were practical things to do, and I did them because not doing felt like surrender. I called the fraud investigator the bank had given me. I went to the courthouse and asked what papers had been filed against Daniel's company. The clerk handed me photocopies, thin and heartless, showing dissolution paperwork and a list of creditors. I sat on a bench in the courthouse lobby and let the words sink into my mouth like cold stones. The investigator told me to freeze accounts, to gather statements, to not sign anything without legal counsel. It sounded clinical, transactional, a series of steps to put bandages on the bleeding. And yet between the practicalities and the paperwork, there was the quieter, darker thing. The absence. The house once full of plans was now full of echoes. The kitchen chair where he'd sat with his elbows on the table was empty. The extra toothbrush in the bathroom drawer remained in place as if waiting for someone who would not return. I opened the closet where his jackets hung for a long time and breathed them in like someone trying to find a scent that would prove the man inside was still himself. I remember, in the quiet hour before morning, whispering to the empty room, "You can lose money, but losing your child, that's something else." The words felt like an admission and an accusation at once. I said them into the air because I had to name the thing that hurt the most. Money can be counted, debated, recovered perhaps with time and effort. But the sense of betrayal, the fissure where trust once was carved, that is not easily measured. There was also a small, stubborn ember of resolve, not yet a plan, but a feeling that I would not let this be the end of my story. The nurse in me, the one who had stood at bedsides and held wrists for pulses, held up a list like a scrubbed shield. There would be lawyers to see. There would be phone calls and inventories and interviews with anyone who might have seen him leave. I would track what I could because that is what I do. I gather facts and I act. But inside, at the core of that methodical purpose, was the other, quieter pain. Loss had taken on a new name, and I was learning how to speak it aloud. The first few weeks after Daniel disappeared were a blur of silence and paperwork. There were days I barely spoke to anyone except the bank clerks or the fraud investigator who called to update me on what I already knew. That my savings were gone. That my son had left no trace of where he went. And that everything I had signed was perfectly legal, even if it wasn't moral. The mornings came slow, like light struggling to enter a locked room. I'd wake, sit at the edge of the bed, and stare at my hands. The same hands that once soothed sick children, comforted patients, built a home, raised a boy, now shaking over a stack of unpaid bills. I grieved for weeks. Not just for the money, or for the betrayal, but for the quiet collapse of something sacred, the bond between a mother and her only child. I found myself walking into Daniel's old room sometimes, opening the closet just to feel the air move around what he left behind. An old flannel shirt, a set of blueprints rolled up tight, a photo of us at the lake years ago, my arm around him, both of us smiling at something that no longer existed. I cried. Of course. But I didn't break. Somewhere in me, that old nurse's instinct, the one that knows how to move even when the world is falling apart, started to wake up. I'd been here before, in different ways. I'd seen life at its most fragile. I'd stood beside gurneys and hospital beds, holding the hands of people who'd just learned their lives had changed forever. I knew what it meant to keep breathing when you didn't want to. So, one morning, I got up, washed my face, tied my hair back, and made coffee strong enough to burn through the fog. Then I spread everything across the kitchen table, the loan papers, the forged contracts, the unpaid bills, the letters from creditors. It looked like chaos, a storm made of paper. But as I started stacking and sorting, a kind of calm settled in. My hands steady again, moved like they used to when I prepped an IV line or checked a chart. I wasn't just cleaning up a mess. I was searching for meaning in the wreckage. I called the legal aid office in town that same afternoon. The young man who answered, his name was Martin, sounded barely older than Daniel. I almost hung up when I heard his voice, but something in his tone was kind. Professional, yes, but also gentle. I told him I needed to speak with someone about financial fraud, about my son. The pause on the line was brief, not judgmental. Just human. Come in tomorrow morning, he said. Bring everything you've got. We'll take it one step at a time. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the rain tapping on the roof, thinking about how strange it was, after 66 years of life, after decades of caring for others, to have to start again. to fight for something that was mine all along. But under the sadness, there was a quiet ember of strength. Not anger, not yet, just resolve. The next morning, I put on a clean blouse, the soft blue one I used to wear to work when I wanted to feel composed. I brushed my hair, packed every folder I had into a canvas tote, and drove to the Legal Aid Center downtown. The building was small, a converted old post office with flaking paint and creaky floors, but it had a warmth to it. There were people sitting in the waiting area, each holding their own stack of papers, their own stories of loss. For the first time in months, I didn't feel alone. When Martin came out to meet me, I noticed right away how young he looked, maybe 30 at most, but his eyes carried a steadiness that reminded me of the nurses I'd trained, people who see hardship and learn not to flinch. He led me into a small office and asked me to start from the beginning. I told him everything, not in the polished, polite way I used at the bank, but in the trembling, messy way it came out when you finally decide to tell the truth. When I finished, he sat back in his chair, fingers steepled, quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Carter, I'm going to be honest with you. This is complicated, but not hopeless." The word hopeless had been following me like a shadow for weeks. Hearing it paired with not felt like a window opening in a stuffy room. He went on to explain that there were ways to trace the transfers, to prove undue influence, even to challenge the loans if signatures were forged. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be fast, but it was possible. Something in me, something long buried, clicked into place. I wasn't just a victim, I was a witness, and witnesses tell the truth. That afternoon, I went home and set up a small desk in the corner of the living room. I cleaned the space like I used to clean a patient's bedside, removing clutter, setting order. I bought a box of manila folders, labeled each one in neat handwriting: accounts, contracts, emails, loan forms, evidence. It was like building a map of a storm I'd already survived. Every piece of paper I filed made me feel a little steadier, like I was reclaiming the parts of myself Daniel had taken without asking. My confidence, my clarity, my control. Days turned into weeks. My routine changed. Mornings were for research, reading legal documents, taking notes from Martin's calls. Afternoons were for errands, trips to the courthouse, the bank, the post office. Evenings were for sorting, thinking, remembering. The grief was still there, but it had changed shape. It wasn't drowning me anymore. It was fuel. I learned to read the patterns, how one forged signature led to another, how a small lie grew into a bigger one. I could see now that Daniel's charm had been his disguise, and his desperation his excuse. The discovery didn't bring me peace exactly, but it brought me understanding. And understanding, I've learned, is its own kind of power. One night, while going through a box of old receipts, I found a notebook Daniel had left behind, the one he used for estimates and client notes. Between pages of numbers and sketches, there was a list titled, "What Mom Taught Me." Underneath were things I'd said over the years. Always double-check your work. People remember how you make them feel. Don't take shortcuts. They'll take something from you in return. Reading it hurt in a way I can't describe. A mix of pride and grief, of knowing that somewhere, deep down, he had remembered the lessons even if he'd chosen to ignore them. I sat there for a long time staring at that page. Then I closed the notebook gently, as if laying something to rest. The next week, Martin called with an update. "We've got movement," he said. "The investigators found a few accounts tied to his business name. He's still using one of them, probably under the radar." "Does that mean he's still in the state?" I asked. "Most likely," he said. "We're working on tracing the transactions. If we can prove intent, we can build a case." For the first time in months, I felt something close to purpose. Not revenge, that word didn't fit. What I wanted wasn't to destroy him. It was to understand the truth clearly enough that it couldn't hurt me anymore, to see the full picture, even if it broke my heart. In the weeks that followed, my house began to feel different. The same walls that had witnessed my grief now echoed with quiet determination. The kitchen table, once covered in bills, became a workspace of order. Each binder, each printed email, each notarized statement was a small act of reclamation. I was building not a case, but a backbone. Friends at the clinic noticed the change in me. "You've got your spark back, Miss Evelyn," one of the volunteers said. I smiled at that. "I guess I'm just doing what I know best," I told her. "Fixing what's broken." But deep down, I knew it wasn't about fixing. It was about seeing, accepting what was healing from it. Late one evening, as the last of the daylight faded through the blinds, I looked around my living room, at the folders stacked neatly on the desk, the clock ticking softly, the lamp casting that warm amber glow I'd missed during the worst days. I realized I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a woman rebuilding herself from the inside out. It was strange, really. All those years I'd been helping others heal. I never learned how to heal myself. Now, in this quiet fight for truth, I was learning, and the lesson was simple. Even when love fails you, you don't have to fail yourself. I didn't know where Daniel was, or if I'd ever hear from him again. But that night, for the first time in a long while, I slept without fear. The storm hadn't passed, but I was standing in it, steady, unbroken, and ready for whatever truth waited to be found. When I first saw the proof, it was printed in black ink across white paper, clean, undeniable, and cold. My name, my handwriting, but not my hand. Martin had called that morning, his voice carrying that steady tone he used when something important was coming. "Mrs. Carter," he said softly, "we've got the confirmation. The signatures on those contracts, they're forged. Every one of them." I sat very still in my chair, holding the receiver against my ear. For a moment, the world around me seemed to quiet. The clock on the wall ticked on. The faint hum of the refrigerator filled the air. But I couldn't hear any of it. There was just the echo of his words and the sound of my own heartbeat, slow and heavy in my chest. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm. "You're sure?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Our forensic specialist verified it. Your son signed your name on multiple contracts and loan applications. That's a criminal act. Criminal act." I repeated those words silently, feeling their weight settle inside me like wet sand. For months I'd suspected it. In the quiet corners of my mind I'd known. But hearing it confirmed made something final click into place. The betrayal wasn't just emotional anymore. It was written into law, carved into ink. I thanked Martin, hung up, and sat there for a long while staring at the window. Outside, the morning light stretched across my garden, catching the soft pink of the roses I'd managed to keep alive through everything. I remember thinking how strange it was that life could keep blooming in the middle of heartbreak. That afternoon, I drove to Martin's office with the papers he needed to move forward. Filing charges wasn't a decision made in anger. It was made in quiet acceptance. I had loved my son more than anyone else on this earth. I had given him my savings, my trust, my time, my forgiveness, all the things a mother can give. But I realized that protecting him now meant losing myself completely, and I wasn't ready to vanish. When I arrived, Martin looked up from his desk. He stood as I entered and gestured for me to sit. "I want you to understand," he said carefully. "This isn't about punishment. It's about accountability. You're not doing this to destroy him, Evelyn. You're doing this to reclaim what's yours." I nodded, my eyes fixed on the folder he placed in front of me. "I understand," I said quietly, "and I'm ready." Filing those papers took less than 15 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. Each signature I placed, my signature, was steady, deliberate, almost ceremonial. When the last document was done, I set the pen down gently, as if laying something to rest. Weeks passed after that, filled with court dates and paperwork, investigators and statements. I learned how to speak in facts again, not emotions. The lawyers called it building a case, but to me, it felt like stitching a wound closed, one careful thread at a time. Then, one gray Tuesday morning, Martin called again. "They've located him," he said. "He's agreed to turn himself in." I didn't answer right away. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the strange mix of relief and sorrow. "Where is he?" I asked finally. "He's here in town," Martin said. "The hearing is scheduled for Friday. You can attend if you'd like." For 2 nights I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what I would say to him if I saw him. The son I'd raised, the man who'd stolen everything but still held a part of my heart. I wrote letters I never sent. I practiced words in the mirror that fell apart in my throat. What do you say to the child who took your trust and turned it into debt? What do you say to someone who once called you mom with love, and now faced you across a courtroom? When Friday came, the courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and paper. The walls seemed to hum with other people's stories, every step echoing with their sorrow, their truth, their reckoning. Martin walked beside me, his presence steady but silent. Then I saw him. Daniel sat at the defense table, his shoulders hunched, his hair longer than I remembered. His suit didn't fit right, and the man I saw wasn't the confident contractor who had once promised me just one more chance. He looked smaller somehow, not in body, but in spirit. When his eyes lifted and met mine, there was no defiance there, only shame. I didn't feel anger. Not the way I expected to. I didn't want to shout or demand answers. All I felt was this deep, quiet ache, like standing over the ruins of something you spent years building, knowing you couldn't rebuild it the same way again. The judge read the charges: fraud, forgery, financial exploitation. Daniel's voice when he spoke was soft, almost broken. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he said. I didn't know how to stop." Those words didn't excuse him, but they explained something. Desperation, weakness, pride. They had all tangled together until he couldn't tell one from the other. And maybe that was the worst part. Not the crime itself, but how human it all was. When the judge asked if I wished to make a statement, I stood. The room quieted, the sound of my shoes on the floor the only noise. My heart pounded, but my voice was steady. "I'm not here for revenge," I said. "I'm here for truth. I gave up my life for my son, my time, my savings, my peace. And I did it out of love. But love without respect isn't love. It's sacrifice, and I've sacrificed enough." I looked at Daniel then. His eyes were wet, and for the first time since he'd left, he looked like the boy I remembered, lost, frightened, sorry. But I didn't reach for him. I didn't comfort him. That wasn't my role anymore. "I'm not here to hurt you," I continued softly. "But I won't protect you either. I raised you to stand tall, and that means standing accountable too. I gave up my life for you. Now, I'm taking it back." The silence that followed was thick, heavy with all the years between us. The laughter, the lies, the love, the loss. Then I turned, walked back to my seat, and felt something inside me, something that had been tied in knots for months, begin to loosen. The judge spoke after that, issuing fines, restitution orders, probation terms. I heard the words but didn't hold on to them. The details didn't matter as much as the feeling of closure beginning to form like dawn breaking through a long night. When the hearing ended, I stood slowly. Daniel tried to speak, his voice cracking with my name. "Mom?" "I'm sorry." I paused at the doorway, my hand on the frame, and for a moment, I let myself feel the ache of every version of him I'd ever loved. The little boy in muddy sneakers, the teenager who fixed the porch steps, the man who'd promised me hope. But I didn't turn around. Some things, I realized, have to be left behind so you can move forward. Outside, the courthouse steps were slick from a light drizzle, the air cool and clean. I walked down slowly, my hand brushing the rail, my spine straight. The sky was the color of pewter, but the light, soft, steady, determined, broke through the clouds like a promise. People passed by me on the street, their lives moving forward, unaware of the small miracle happening inside me, the quiet reclaiming of self. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking as someone's mother, someone's caretaker, someone's safety net. I was walking as Evelyn Carter, a woman who had lost everything she thought she needed. and found herself instead. When I reached my car, I paused, looking back at the courthouse one last time. The rain had started again, gentle, persistent, cleansing. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and let it fall on my face. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like release. And as I opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat, I realized something. Sometimes justice isn't loud. It doesn't come with shouting or vengeance or grand gestures. Sometimes it's quiet. A single woman walking away from the courthouse, her head high, her spirit unbent, her future finally her own. The first spring after everything had settled felt different in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't dramatic. There were no grand revelations or sudden reunions, just mornings that came with birdsong again, and the small, steady work of keeping a life. I wake up now to the sound of the surf tapping the shore a few blocks away, a softer rhythm than the city I'd left behind. I make my coffee in a cup that does not have a chip this time, because I let myself buy something new. The house is smaller, yes, but the rooms fit me the way a good pair of shoes fits a foot that finally knows its shape. When I moved here, my daughter helped. Rachel loaded the last of my boxes with a cheerful efficiency I remembered from her school plays and church potlucks. We laughed in the kitchen the first night, peeling off labels and setting plates on a table I'd chosen because it had room for both meals and sorting bills. Though there are far fewer bills now that I'm careful and deliberate about what I keep. Rachel left with a hug and a promise to visit, and I stood in the doorway and watched the road swallow her car until she was just a dot. It sounded like a small thing, but the ache of being watched leave was different now. It was softer, less like a wound and more like a seam mended. My roses are here too. I brought a few from the old garden in the back of my car like small talismans. Gracie, Hope, William. The names I'd given them after the people I loved. They took to the coastal soil slowly. Stubborn as I'd been all those years, I coaxed life from a hospital ward that sometimes didn't want to be coaxed. It felt right to plant them here, in a place that smelled like salt and possibility. I tend them in the mornings, my knees wrapped in an old pad, my hands in the dirt where the feel of earth reminds me of the basic truth that things grow if you give them time and tending. The days are full in a way they weren't before. I volunteer at a shelter a few blocks from my house, a small place with bright curtains and a whiteboard full of schedules. The women who come there are different from the patients I knew at the clinic. Their wounds are not always visible, but they are deep. Financial abuse leaves a particular kind of bruise, not always a missing limb, but a missing map. They arrive bewildered, sometimes ashamed, sometimes angry, often quiet. I sit with them. I listen. I help them fill out forms if they need it. I tell them what I know about checking signatures and where to get a free legal consult. I do not preach. I offer the thing that mattered most to me when I had less of myself to give. Steady hands and a steady presence. When a woman comes in who looks as tired as I once did, I make her a cup of tea and we sit at the small round table. She unburdens in pieces. A missing paycheck here, a loan taken out in her name there, a partner who seemed charming until the papers started to pile up. I tell her the practical things first. Freeze the account, call the bank's fraud line, gather statements, because habit is how I keep myself from drowning, and often a list is what gives a frightened person the breathing room to think. Then I tell her something else, softer, that being betrayed doesn't make you foolish. It makes you human. It surprises me how much that line matters. I learned something important in those conversations. Shame is a shadow best faced in daylight. When you talk about it, aloud, clearly, it loses some of its power. I see that in their faces when they begin to breathe a little easier. They look up at me and ask, "How did you do it?" And I tell them a truth that still surprises me when I hear it. I did the work in small steps. One phone call, one visit to a lawyer, one folder at a time. Little by little, you take the pieces you can find and lay them out so you can see the shape of what happened. People ask, sometimes, if I ever regretted the helping, the giving, the trust. I answer honestly. I regret the way he betrayed me. I regret the cost it put on my shoulders, and the nights I spent wondering what I could have done differently. But I don't regret the love. Love is not an invoice you can look back on and find a single wrong line. It is a long ledger of moments, and most of them were worth the price. Even the mistakes taught me something. That my value was never just in service to someone else, but in the steady keeping of myself. The legal things are settled now, mostly. The accounts were frozen. A portion of what was taken was recovered, though not all of it. The restitution orders are in place, but it was never just about money. For months I kept imagining that if the money returned, the trust would too. I have learned that money is a blunt instrument, and trust is a delicate thing. The court handled what courts handle. The rest was mine to reckon with. I think about Daniel sometimes. Not with the brazen hope of reconciliation. That chapter closed in a courtroom with neat legal phrases. But I think about him in the quiet morning, and sometimes on the telephone when a clerk calls to confirm a paper I've signed, or an address that changed. When the wind lifts the curtains and the roses bend, I let myself remember the good things. The boy with sawdust on his hands who once fixed a broken birdhouse for me. The man who taught a neighbor's child how to hang a picture straight. Those memories are not contradictory to the pain. They live alongside it, like two different rooms in the same house. Some evenings, I sit on the small porch that overlooks the dune grass and a slice of the sea. The light at sunset here is different from Savannah's. Sharper, maybe, or kinder in a way that lets you see outlines clearly. I wrap my sweater around me and drink tea from my new cup, and think about the way life rearranges itself around what survives. The roses bloom and the tide goes in and out. I keep a small notebook where I jot down things I want to teach at the shelter. How to read a bank statement, how to spot a forged signature, how to tell a lender that you'd like every interaction in writing. Rules are useful. Practice is power. Once, a woman at the shelter brought me a small pot of herbs she'd grown. "For you," she said, fumbling with the paper wrap. "You helped me file the paperwork so I could keep my grandmother's home." I took the gift with hands that began to tremble and felt a warm ribbon tie between us. "You did the work," I told her. "I just helped you see what you already had." It was the truth. The work of reclaiming yourself is always yours. We only help one another remember how to do it. People ask me how I feel about forgiveness. It is a complicated word. There is a kind of forgiveness that is an erasure, wiping clean as if nothing happened. I do not believe in that. I have learned to forgive in a different way, as a release. To forgive someone does not mean you erase the wrong. It means you no longer let the wrong define your days. Forgiveness for me has looked like letting go of the need to be defined by what happened to me. It has looked like mornings spent tending roses instead of rereading court transcripts. It has looked like the small, stubborn joy of learning a new recipe or calling a friend simply to hear their voice. I find joy now in predictable things. The way the sun warms my thighs when I sit by the window with a book. The sound of gulls arguing over a scrap of bread. The very ordinary pleasure of a well-made cup of coffee. I find purpose in showing up for the women at the shelter. In teaching them the small rules that make the world less confusing. My days are full, but not crowded. There is room for peace. Sometimes people tell me they admire my strength. I tell them the truth. Strength is not a shout. It is a series of small decisions. It is getting up even when your heart wants to stay under the covers. It is sitting down with a pile of papers that tell a story you don't want to read and sorting them anyway. It is planting a rose bush in soil that looks tired and watching it wake up. Strength can be quiet. Strength can be tender. Strength can be a woman who, after everything, learns how to make a life that is hers. There are times the loneliness finds me. Those evenings, I call Rachel or a friend, or I go sit by the water where the horizon is wide and the world seems to hold its breath a little. The loneliness is honest and not shameful. It is the echo of a love that changed in shape. I talk to it sometimes, as I used to talk to William in the garden, and I tell it I'm okay. I tell it I am learning. Sometimes the act of naming the thing that hurts makes it lighter. If there is a lesson I would want to leave, to whisper to someone listening who might be sitting where I sat, it's this. Keep a file. Keep an account. Keep friends who will tell you the truth when you ask them to. Learn the language of your finances the way you might learn the names of plants. And when the ground where you planted your trust is turned up, tend what you can and let what you cannot tend go. The work of reclaiming yourself is not shameful or petty. It is sacred. I have come to think of the roses as part of a small ceremony of healing. Each bloom is not an affirmation that what happened was right, but it is evidence that life continues, that it is possible to stand again where something tried to knock you down and say, quietly, "Not today." The petals fall in the compost and make new soil. The roots dig deeper. So I tend the roses, and I volunteer, and I teach. And sometimes I sit with a cup of tea and watch a gull wheel over the waves. I am not the same person I was before. I am better in ways that matter. I have a clearer line between giving and being used. I have a tenderness for women who make the mistake of trusting wrong, and a fierceness when someone tries to take what is mine. If you've listened this far, maybe you know someone who needs to hear this. You can survive betrayal and find your life again. It may look different, smaller in some ways and fuller in others, but it can be yours in a way that is honest and whole. If you found something here that helped even a little, please like the video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe for more stories like this. Quiet, true stories about people who fall and then stand back up. Thank you for sitting with me.